She said nothing at first, just stood there with a calm that felt dangerous, and that made people uncomfortable. Not because she was loud or demanding. She wasn't. It was the way her silence took up space. The navy coat she wore was sharp, elegant, hugging her frame like it belonged there. A deep blue African silk scarf folded beneath the collar, knotted with care. Not for show, but for pride. Her carry-on rolled behind her with a soft hum across the floor, matching her steps with quiet precision. When she paused in front of the first-class boarding lane, no one said anything out loud, but something shifted. A woman near the back glanced up from her phone. A man adjusted his posture. Even the gate agent, Shelby Whitmore, blinked twice and straightened her shoulders, lips parting before she even knew why. Zariah hadn't spoken, hadn't even made eye contact, but somehow, her presence had already unsettled the line. It was the kind of silence people weren't used to answering. There are moments when silence feels louder than outrage, and this was one of them. Shelby leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing behind her customer service smile. "Are you sure you're in the right line?" Her voice was light, friendly on the surface, but carried an edge that wasn't. It wasn't a question. It was a challenge dressed in policy, the kind meant to push people off balance while still letting her deny it later. Zariah didn't blink. She looked Shelby square in the eye and placed her boarding pass and ID on the counter. Deliberate, measured, precise. "Bennett. Zariah. Dr. Zariah Bennett. First class." Her tone didn't rise. Her posture didn't shift, but everything around her did. Tyler Nash, the younger agent standing nearby, glanced over and froze halfway through a sip of coffee. A woman behind Zariah lowered her sunglasses. The air didn't explode. It tightened, compressed, because in that moment, everyone realized the problem wasn't confusion. The problem was that Shelby had assumed. "Excuse me, would you just say?" Shelby leaned in, her brows arched with a kind of disbelief that seemed practiced. She picked up Zariah's boarding pass and ID, tilting them slightly like she was inspecting them for forgery. "I'm just not seeing it here. Are you sure this is yours?" Her voice remained cool, but loud enough now for people nearby to catch the tone. Zariah didn't reply immediately. She let the question settle. Around them, the hum of airport announcements continued, but the immediate space grew quieter. Tyler Nash shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking between the screen and the name in front of him. "It's valid," he said under his breath, but Shelby ignored him. She retyped Zariah's name slowly, her fingers punching the keyboard a little too hard. "I do see your reservation," she finally said, her smile tightening, "but it looks like it's been modified. I'm showing an economy seat now. 44. She slid the reprinted boarding pass across the counter like a warning. "Excuse me, what did you just say?" Shelby leaned in, her brows arched with a kind of disbelief that seemed practiced. She picked up Zariah's boarding pass and ID, tilting them slightly like she was inspecting them for forgery. "I'm just not seeing it here. Are you sure this is yours?" Her voice remained cool, but loud enough now for people nearby to catch the tone. Zariah didn't reply immediately. She let the question settle. Around them, the hum of airport announcements continued, but the immediate space grew quieter. Tyler Nash shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking between the screen and the name in front of him. "It's valid," he said under his breath, but Shelby ignored him. She retyped Zariah's name slowly, her fingers punching the keyboard a little too hard. "I do see your reservation," she finally said, her smile tightening, "but it looks like it's been modified. I'm showing an economy seat now. 44. She slid the reprinted boarding pass across the counter like a warning. Zariah didn't touch the new boarding pass. Her eyes remained on Shelby's. "That's not the class I booked." Shelby didn't blink. "Feel free to take it up with customer service, Dr. Bennett. I'm just following what the system tells me." The tone on Doctor was syrupy, polite on the surface, disrespectful underneath. Tyler opened his mouth, then stopped. He reached for the keyboard again, but Shelby nudged his arm gently with her elbow. never breaking her smile. "We've a schedule to keep," she muttered. Zariah finally looked down at the boarding pass. Her thumb brushed across the paper once, slowly. Then she exhaled and said nothing. She wasn't going to give Shelby the satisfaction of reacting. That restraint, the grace under fire, was its own kind of thunder. And for a moment, Shelby looked like she'd rather Zariah had just yelled, "That's quite the accent you've got there." Shelby didn't even look up from her keyboard. Her fingers tapped slowly, deliberately, as if searching for a reason to delay. Zariah's face didn't move, but a faint pause lingered in her breath. "Excuse me," she said, calm but firm. Shelby shrugged. "Nothing. Just always interesting hearing how people pronounce things." She let the words hang in the air like a smirk. Then, without warning, she clicked twice and said, "Looks like you've been moved to economy. Seat 44E. She printed the pass, slid it across the counter with 2 fingers, and turned away, like the conversation was over. A few passengers glanced toward them now. No one said a word. Zariah looked down at the pass, then back up at Shelby. "This isn't a seat I booked." Her voice remained even, but colder. "Feel free to speak with the supervisor," Shelby replied, already typing again. But this is all the system shows. She had no idea the woman she'd just humiliated was the founder of Altura Ventures. Zariah finally took the new pass without looking at it. "I'd like a supervisor, please." Her voice was low, controlled. Shelby raised her brows. "They're all busy at the moment. You're welcome to wait over there." She gestured vaguely toward the waiting area. Tyler shifted again. "I'll ping someone," he offered quietly. Shelby didn't stop him this time. Zariah nodded and stepped aside. She didn't make a scene. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked toward the seating near gate C-17, heels tapping softly, pulling her suitcase behind her. Her back stayed straight. Her chin never dropped. But every step she took was weighted with grace that didn't bow. And though no one clapped, and no heads turned dramatically, something shifted in the room. The tension didn't break. It thickened. Passengers started whispering once she left the counter. A woman leaned toward her partner. "That was weird, right?" Another man frowned. Pretty sure she was first class. But no one said anything to Shelby. She resumed scanning boarding passes as if nothing had happened. But Tyler kept glancing over his shoulder, back toward where Zariah now sat. She hadn't opened her phone, hadn't moved, just sat, hands folded over her coat, watching the jetway. And Tyler, he couldn't shake the weight in his gut. Not just guilt, but the sense that something larger had just occurred, like someone had drawn a line, and he'd been standing on the wrong side of it. It wasn't about policy. It was about posture, humanity, respect. And deep down, he knew they just failed a test they didn't realize was being taken. "Can I see your supervisor?" A new voice at the counter. A young black woman. Clear, direct, polite. Shelby smiled. "Of course." One moment, she tapped her headset. "Supervisor request at C-17. Her voice had its usual cheer, but her eyes darted sideways toward Tyler. He was already standing, posture stiff. The new woman stepped aside, and others began to murmur now too. Zariah still didn't move, but the air around her had. Tyler stepped forward, and finally, Shelby's confidence began to crack. She looked over at Zariah, and for the first time, hesitated, because a silence like that doesn't stay quiet forever. And respect, once lost, isn't something you just reprint at the counter, because by the time the supervisor arrived late, flustered, and holding a tablet, the damage was done. 3 other passengers had approached the counter asking questions. One had even filmed. And Zariah, she was still seated, unreadable, a force without motion. Shelby tried to explain. The system glitch, the reassignment, the mix-up, but the supervisor didn't nod, didn't smile, just scrolled, tapped and frowned. Tyler, meanwhile, stepped back, hands behind his back, because he already knew what was coming. You don't erase moments like that with protocol. You don't undo humiliation with policy. And as the supervisor asked to speak privately, Shelby finally stepped out from behind the counter, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Zariah Bennett stood slowly, her movements deliberate, measured. She slipped her phone back in her coat pocket and reached for the handle of her suitcase, its leather grip cool and familiar in her hand. Around her, the terminal continued its practiced rhythm. Boarding calls echoed. Wheels rolled across polished tile. Agents chirped into earpieces. But beneath the hum of routine, something else had settled. A stillness. A fracture too quiet to notice, but too deep to ignore. As Zariah walked past the gate, her figure straight and dignified, the air felt denser somehow. Shelby Whitmore glanced up instinctively, catching a glimpse of Zariah's back, disappearing into the concourse. She didn't know why she looked, but the smirk that had clung to her lips all morning was gone now, replaced by something tighter, more uncertain. No words had been exchanged, no scenes made. But even before Zariah exited gate C-17, the sinner had already started to slip. Tyler Nash watched her go, breath caught somewhere between guilt and relief. He didn't say anything, not when she stood, not when she passed by, not even when her silhouette dissolved into the rhythm of other travelers. But his eyes followed her, as if trying to memorize a path he couldn't take back. The words he'd whispered to her, "They don't want you in first class," still burned on his tongue. He hadn't meant to say them aloud, but once they'd left his lips, the truth had no more use for hiding. Now, he stood behind the counter again, hands twitching over the keyboard, trying to resume his role. But the air around him felt charged, like the seconds before a lightning strike. The smile on Shelby's face didn't return, and Tyler knew why. Zariah had said nothing more. No protest, no threat. And yet, the silence she left behind pressed harder than any confrontation they'd ever witnessed. Alyssa Carter lingered just outside the boarding tunnel, her hands still gripping the lapel of her blazer, knuckles pale. She had passed Zariah earlier, barely a glance exchanged, but the image had burned itself into her mind. The calm in Zariah's expression, the dignity in her silence, the restraint in her walk. It haunted Alyssa more than if Zariah had screamed, because she hadn't, and that absence forced Alyssa to confront her own. She hadn't intervened. She hadn't spoken up. She had simply adjusted her uniform, averted her eyes, and moved on. But now, standing there as passengers filed past her, she couldn't ignore the echo in her chest. The look Zariah had given her, it hadn't judged, hadn't pleaded. It had simply seen her. And being seen like that, fully, silently, unraveled something Alyssa had carefully kept buried. She looked down at her ID badge, fingers trembling. For the first time, the plastic rectangle felt heavier than it ever had before. Zariah moved through the concourse with unshaken posture, her coat swaying gently behind her, suitcase wheels gliding soundlessly over tile. She didn't rush. She didn't pause. She walked like someone who belonged everywhere, which made her absence from gate C-17 feel even louder. The boarding monitors continued to cycle through names. The terminal announcements kept playing, and yet there was a flicker. At first, it was barely noticeable. A stall in a reservation system, a repeat of a last name, a misaligned seating chart. Two small things, but enough to create friction. At the counter, Shelby's fingers hesitated. Tyler kept glancing toward the security checkpoint. Even passengers started shifting, their tones quieter, eyes flicking between staff. Zariah didn't look back once. She didn't need to. The system behind her had already started a fray, thread by thread. Not because she broke it, but because she removed the one thing holding it together, the illusion that everything was fine. Back at the gate, the line of passengers had stalled. Some murmured among themselves, pointing to the flickering screen above the counter. One woman clutched her boarding pass tighter, glancing between Shelby and Tyler with a raised brow. The crowd wasn't angry. Not yet, but the tension hung thick like humid air before a summer storm. Shelby tapped her earpiece, but got only static. Tyler pretended to troubleshoot, fingers flying over keys that yielded nothing. They exchanged no words, but their silence spoke volumes. In the break room, another gate agent frowned at the system monitor, watching as confirmed upgrades vanish from the interface. No warning, no explanation. Alyssa, still at the threshold of the tunnel, turned her head slowly. She could feel it too. Something intangible had shifted. Not chaos, not outrage. Something deeper, a collective unease that couldn't be named yet, but had a source. And they all knew exactly who had walked out with. Downstairs, near the employee locker corridor, two junior agents stood hunched over a tablet, scrolling through flagged error reports. "It's like the system's working, but not for us," one whispered. The other nodded slowly, eyes darting toward the break room, where Shelby had disappeared moments earlier. Nobody said Zariah's name, but her presence lingered like a scent in the air. Undeniable and untraceable. Alyssa finally peeled off her blazer, hands clammy. She couldn't shake the memory of Zariah's eyes, calm and piercing. She replayed the moment in her mind, the way Shelby had slid that pass across the counter, the forced smirk, the mocking tone, and how none of them, not one, had intervened. They were trained for protocol, but not for conscience. Trained to comply, but never to question. Now, with every minor malfunction and growing tension, the question reverberated in Alyssa's chest. What else had they normalized under the banner of just doing our jobs? As the day wore on, the airport returned to motion, but not to normal. Flights boarded, planes took off, but something in the eyes of the staff had changed. Alyssa walked past the gate counter hours later, the lights dim now, the screen blank. Shelby's shift had ended. Tyler had left without saying goodbye, and yet their absence didn't erase the echo of what had happened there. It lingered in the hesitation of every passenger who approached the gate. It trembled in the pause before each boarding announcement. The terminal moved, but not with ease. Somewhere across the city, Zariah was likely in a quiet space, reading, thinking, already charting what came next. But here, inside this building, those left behind weren't simply processing a disruption. They were confronting a reflection. No speech had been made, no public apology issued. And yet, a reckoning had begun, not with noise, but with the kind of silence that refuses to fade. The automatic doors hissed shut behind her, muffling the buzz of gate C-17. Zariah moved swiftly but not hurriedly through the corridor, the wheels of her suitcase humming against the polished floor. She entered the private elevator to the upper lounge, swiped her card, and the doors closed again, this time behind silence. The transition from terminal noise to insulated quiet wasn't just spatial, it was symbolic. The further she moved from that counter, the more control she reclaimed. Inside the executive lounge, a concierge greeted her with a soft nod, but Zariah didn't pause. She walked straight to the farthest window, overlooking the tarmac. Sunlight flooded the room in streaks. She sat, unlocked her phone, and tapped a single word into an encrypted app ready. No grand commands, no press statements, just one word, a signal, a switch flipped somewhere far from Atlanta. And yet, the consequences were already walking back toward Shelby Whitmore. At gate C-17, Shelby Whitmore was mid-sentence with a new passenger when the check-in screen blinked, just once. Then again, a quiet stutter in the system. Weird. She muttered, tapping the refresh icon. The boarding queue hesitated. Tyler Nash glanced at the monitor beside her, his brows tightening. "That's not right," he said, voice low. Passenger names were misaligned. Seat numbers were shifting randomly. The interface began looping, flickering between menus like a ghost tapping through taps. "Is there an outage?" Alyssa asked as she approached from the jet bridge, sensing the tension. "No alerts," Tyler replied, already pulling out his tablet. But the glitches spread. One terminal, then two. By the time the third froze, passengers began to murmur. Some stepped out of line. Others checked their apps, only to find their boarding passes had vanished. Shelby forced a laugh, probably just a sync delay, but her fingers were clenched, and for the first time, her smile didn't stick. Upstairs in the airline's operations center, a technician leaned forward, staring at the anomaly. "We've got a live desync at gate C-17, he said, voice clipped. "Systems rejecting active manifests and scrambling gate assignments." A supervisor moved closer, coffee forgotten in hand. "Scrambling?" Like on its own. The tech didn't answer. On the screen, rows of data flickered. Names, routes, baggage tags, cycling and resetting at irregular intervals. "Kill the gate server," the supervisor ordered. "Force a reboot," but it didn't respond. The command hung, ignored. "Try to fail over," someone else added. Nothing. Panic spread in undertones. Calm on the surface, frantic underneath. Meanwhile, down below, passengers were beginning to record with their phones. The line had devolved into confusion. Tyler fielded questions with shaky patience. Shelby kept tapping, harder with each attempt. "Why isn't this working?" she snapped. No one answered, but somewhere in a distant server, the word "ready" had already become "now." By mid-morning, other gates began to feel the ripple. Digital kiosks rebooted in loops. Frequent flyer status mismatches triggered security flags. Lounge access cards were denied. The gate manager near D7 radioed in, confused, about a full manifest, but the system's only showing 2 passengers. Down at baggage, Hamler stared as carousel instructions vanished mid-cycle. "Someone's inside the backbone," one IT lead whispered upstairs. "Not breaking it, bending it." And through it all, Zariah Bennett remained seated in the private lounge, eyes calm, fingers still. She wasn't watching the chaos directly. She didn't need to. Her phone buzzed once. A quiet confirmation, not of destruction, but disruption. The kind that doesn't scream. It rearranges, reprioritizes, reshapes, and everyone affected could sense it, even if they didn't understand it. The network wasn't crashing. It was choosing. And at gate C-17, Shelby's fingers hovered, paralyzed above the keyboard. For the first time all morning, she had no instructions. Inside the executive offices 2 floors above, a quiet tension began to build. Department heads gathered in a side conference room, speaking in clipped tones. "Do we have any confirmation on who was affected first?" someone asked. Another replied, "It started at C-17. A Dr. Bennett." Silence. Then a third voice, cautious. "You mean Zariah Bennett?" Papers stilled. No one nodded, but no one disagreed. A quick query through internal systems revealed affiliations too powerful to ignore. Founder of a $950 million global travel group, major contracts across 3 continents, ties to regulatory advisory boards and airport equity initiatives. One executive swallowed hard. "Has anyone contacted her?" No answer. No one wanted to be the first, because this wasn't a customer complaint. This was a name that could redirect funding, close terminals, shift narratives, and she hadn't even made a phone call yet. She had simply walked away, and systems were already apologizing. Down at the gate, Shelby was no longer smirking. Her jaw clenched as she watched Tyler speak in hushed tones with a supervisor who had just arrived from Central Dispatch. The man didn't scold her. He didn't need to. His clip questions said enough. Did she present a valid boarding pass? Did you confirm her ID? Did she request escalation? Each query chipped away at her facade. There was confusion. Shelby offered weakly. It didn't speak clearly at first, but even she didn't believe it now. The supervisor's pen hovered. Passenger's name again. She hesitated. Zariah Bennett. The moment the name left her lips, he stiffened slightly. No comment. Just a quick scribble in his notepad. "Stay here." And then he walked off. No comfort. No defense. Alyssa glanced over from the jet bridge. Eyes wide, lips tight. Tyler refused to meet Shelby's gaze. The air felt heavier now, like a reckoning had entered the room, and was still deciding where to land. Back in the lounge, Zariah remained seated, her gaze steady on the glass beyond. Planes came and went. None of them mattered. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a brief update from her executive assistant. Initial coordination underway. Equity partners aligned. Legal inquiry drafted. No drama. No fritz. Just logistics. Zariah typed a short reply. Proceed, as discussed. As she locked the screen and exhaled, not in frustration, but in resolve. Across the country, inboxes began filling. Stakeholders received meeting requests marked urgent. Regulatory contacts were looped in quietly. Vendor negotiations paused. Sponsorship renewals flagged. And still, Zariah said nothing, but everyone would hear her message soon. Not shouted from podiums, not blasted in headlines, but embedded in policy revisions, in redline contracts, in broken partnerships that once felt invincible. She didn't need to raise her voice, because power doesn't always speak. Sometimes it simply moves, and when it does, the entire structure learns how fragile it really was. As the automated voice echoed across gate C-17 announcing final boarding, no one noticed the silence Zariah left behind. Not the passengers gathering carry-outs, not the attendants adjusting their ties, not even the supervisors reviewing their handheld logs. But it was there, a rupture too subtle to sound alarms, but deep enough to shift fault lines. The systems kept humming, the kiosks blinked as usual, but beneath the fluorescent calm, something was shifting. Some sensed it, but couldn't name it. Others ignored the tightening of the air, and a few, like Tyler, felt to crawl up their spine like static. Zariah's departure had been quiet, almost forgettable, but the echo of her final words, "This story doesn't end at gate C-17, still clung to the glass walls like fog, and by the time the terminal exhaled again, it was already too late. The unraveling had begun, and no one had the language for it. Yet, Tyler Nash stood frozen behind the counter, fingers hovering over the keyboard but unable to press a single key. His body moved on autopilot, but his thoughts were splintering. Every now and then, his eyes flicked toward the far end of the concourse where Zariah had disappeared minutes earlier. The weight in his chest hadn't lifted. It had grown. Behind him, Shelby continued issuing boarding passes with her usual sweet sharpness, but her voice wavered on every third word. She hadn't processed it yet, not fully, but something inside her had shifted. The way passengers stared longer than usual, the way colleagues passed without saying hello. It all registered, but she pushed it down. Farther down the terminal, Alyssa Carter stood outside the staff break room, gripping her lanyard so tightly her knuckles whitened. The air had changed. Not louder, not panicked, just electric, like the stillness before a summer storm you didn't see forming. Shelby Whitmore tapped her earpiece again, twice, then a third time, only to hear static. The channel was live, but no one responded. She glanced at the nearest monitor. The check-in queue lengthened by the second, yet the screen froze between passenger profiles. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she masked it with a quick sip from her water bottle. Just a glitch, she muttered under her breath. But she knew better. Her instincts had never failed her. The smirk she'd worn like armor all morning now cracked at the corners. She replayed Zariah's tone. Not loud, not angry, but deliberate. It was a voice that didn't plead. It promised. And the way Tyler had looked at her afterward, like he knew they'd crossed the line, made her chest tighten. She had dismissed passengers before. She'd been snide before, but never had one walked away like that, as if she already knew exactly what was coming. In a quiet corner of the airport's executive lounge, Dr. Zariah Bennett sat with her phone resting on the table in front of her. Its screen dim now, but the word ready still burned in her mind. Her assistant confirmation had been brief, but that was all she needed. As Shelby stumbled through passenger reassignments and Tyler fumbled with override codes, Zariah's network of legal advisors, partner liaisons, and systems analysts moved in sync. Entire travel blocks flagged for internal audit, group contracts frozen, Priority boarding statuses revoked for key corporate partners. No statement had been made, no announcement broadcast, but the shift was unmistakable. One by one, airline systems began logging inconsistencies. Nothing catastrophic, just irregular. Enough to draw attention, enough to trigger protocol reviews. And in the silence of that lounge, Zariah didn't need to speak. The system would unravel under its own weight. All she had done was refuse to hold it up. Upstairs in the airport's operations center, Gavin Ross, the shift supervisor, stood before a row of monitors, his brow furrowed. At first, he thought it was just a tech hiccup, but now, booking queues were duplicating entries. Vendor authorizations flickered on and off. Boarding tiers reassigned themselves. Nothing had been flagged as malicious, but everything was wrong. He called IT. They hadn't pushed any new updates. He called compliance. They hadn't authorized overrides. But the system kept bending subtly, efficiently. It was too quiet to be accidental. Gavin looked toward the log of special accounts flagged for audit. One name had just triggered a cascade of internal reviews. Altura Ventures. He didn't recognize it first, but the red-coded alert next to it pulsed with authority. Something was happening, and whoever had set in motion had planned every step. This wasn't a customer complaint. It was a strategic disengagement, and the wheels were already off the track. Alyssa Carter stood in the narrow corridor near the service galley, heart pounding so loudly it almost drowned out the boarding calls overhead. For hours, she had told herself it wasn't her fault, that she was just doing her job, that she hadn't really participated, but she had. Her silence was participation. She remembered how Zariah had looked at her. Not accusing, not pleading, just seeing. And Alyssa hadn't been able to meet that gaze. Not then, but now, with the terminal unraveling and whispers sweeping through staff lounges, she felt something shift inside her. She pulled out her employee badge and pressed the intercom. "Supervisor Gavin Ross, please respond," she said, voice barely steady. When his voice answered, tight and wary, she took a breath. "I need to report something that happened at gate C-17. It wasn't protocol, and it wasn't right." Her voice shook, but she didn't back down. By evening, the airport's polished rhythm had begun to fray. Gate delays spiked. Passengers grumbled. Supervisors whispered over radios in clipped tones. And in the break room, Shelby sat alone, staring at her reflection in the microwave door. Her smile, once so sharp, now looked like a costume. Tyler sat across from her, silent, his hand twitching as he scrolled through internal logs filled with red flags. Neither spoke, neither needed to. The fallout was already beyond them. Somewhere above, Zariah's plane had likely taken off hours ago, but her presence lingered, like static in events, like silence with weight. She hadn't yelled, she hadn't demanded, she had simply withdrawn, and with that quiet refusal, she'd taken the floor out from under them. What was left was not chaos, but consequence. What had been normal had been exposed, and what had been ignored now refused to disappear. From the outside, it looked like nothing had changed. Flights continued boarding, announcements kept looping, coffee cups were refilled, luggage wheels turned, and people moved. But beneath all that motion, something had shifted. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Zariah had walked away hours ago. No security, no media, no confrontation, and yet, her absence now held more weight than anyone's presence. In the quiet vacuum she left behind, policies were being re-examined. People were being retrained. Systems, once untouched, were being rewritten. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't issued demands. What she'd done was far more precise. She had withdrawn not just her ticket, not just her presence, but her trust. And in doing so, she exposed the unspoken scaffolding of power that had allowed casual cruelty to pass as procedure. What shattered wasn't a moment. It was the illusion that silence meant surrender. Zariah Bennett didn't need headlines. She didn't need applause. The impact of her response rippled not through viral outrage, but through strategic absence. By the time internal reports reached the desks of regional directors, it was already too late to contain. Altura Ventures had quietly pulled out of multiple partner initiatives. Legacy bookings vanished from priority pipelines. Corporate accounts flagged for reevaluation were met with silence. Not threats, just silence. The same silence Zariah had offered when the boarding pass slid across the counter. But now that silence had shape. It had direction. It forced questions. It forced discomfort. In an industry used to customer noise and reactionary PR, this was something else entirely. Zariah had turned stillness into a mirror. And now, everyone from floor agents to boardroom executives had a look. And what they saw was not just one woman walking away. It was a standard being redrawn. In her Charlotte office, surrounded by warm wood tones and soft afternoon light, Zariah reviewed the final drafts of Altura's new partnership framework. The language was clear, uncompromising. Dignity was not a reward. It was a requirement. She paused over one line. We will not fund what devalues people. It was simple, but it changed everything. It meant that vendors who ignored bias in their frontline staff wouldn't just face reprimand. They'd face disassociation. It meant that systems designed for efficiency but blind to equity were no longer acceptable. And it meant that silence, once mistaken for neutrality, would now be counted as complicity. Zariah knew this wouldn't be easy. Some partners would walk away. Others would resist. But for the first time in years, she felt aligned with the reason she had started Altura in the first place. Not to scale power, but to restore purpose. Not to protect silence, but to elevate truth. Later that week, Zariah arrived at the Asheville Hillside Center, a secluded mountain retreat Altura, typically reserved for strategic planning. But this time there were no white bards, no spreadsheets, just people. Around the long wooden table sat community leaders, ethical compliance officers, accessibility advocates, and a few long-time partners whose track records spoke louder than logos. There were no welcome speeches, no branding, just a simple question from Zariah to open the room. What does it take to make dignity systemic? The room sat in silence at first, not out of awkwardness, but out of reverence. Then, slowly voices emerged. Stories poured forward. Some shared quiet failures. Others spoke of battles fought in invisible spaces. Inside HR, inside vendor pipelines, inside code. No one spoke in bullet points. No one postured. And Zariah listened, really listened, not as a CEO protecting her brand, but as a woman rebuilding the ground beneath it. By the second day, the group had moved from stories to structure. Not slogans, not vision statements, but infrastructure. What would it look like to embed empathy into vendor selection? How could employee training address not just bias, but silence? What would it take for systems to alert, not hide, when discretion became discrimination? As the sun dipped behind a ridgeline, Zariah stood at the head of the table once more. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't deliver a speech. She just said, "We're not here to repair what failed. We're here to make sure it can't be built broken again." Heads nodded, not in politeness, but in alignment. What started as a response to humiliation had become a recalibration of power. This wasn't about punishing an airline. It was about removing the oxygen that allowed quiet harm to breathe. And in that moment, Zariah understood. Change was not just possible. It was already happening. When the retreat concluded, there was no press release, no tweet thread, no press conference, just handshakes, handwritten notes, and quiet resolve. Attendees left with action plans, not PR plans. Zariah didn't pose for photos. She didn't rehearse a closing statement. Instead, she stood outside the lodge for a moment, watching as the last car disappeared down the gravel path. The wind was soft, the trees stood still, and for the first time in days, the silence wasn't heavy, it was whole. Inside her phone, unread messages stacked from media outlets seeking comment. She didn't open them. The story wasn't theirs to shape. Not this time. What happened at Gate C-17 had never been about optics. It had been about values. And now, those values were in motion. In contracts, in conversations, in culture. Quietly, unmistakably, and without delay. Zariah Bennett never raised her voice. She didn't have to. Her authority was never in her title. It was in her refusal to normalize what everyone else whispered through. She had turned silence into a scalpel, cutting through layers of policy and pretense. Her story wasn't one of spectacle. It was one of symmetry, where disrespect had been casual. Her response had been calculated, where others would have demanded seats. She dismantled the stage. And now, across boardrooms and terminals alike, people spoke her name not in scandal, but in standard. She reminded the world that justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it walks away with everything. And when it does, it leaves behind more than absence. It leaves the blueprint for something better. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And that is how systems change.